answer this. I
Just by
haven't
knowing
preached
you.
yet. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Alright.
All right. So, have you guys ever felt powerless?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Powerless in a situation like it's a new situation, or it's a situation where you're trying to control, and maybe you don't have a lot of control, or somebody's doing something to you and you are powerless. There's a lot of different ways that we can be powerless, but it's a scary feeling. I think of powerlessness, I think of that like really uncomfortable feeling in the pit of your gut that you feel, and you're like, oh, I need a little more power and control in this situation. We've all been there. Jesus was actually there too. In the desert, when he faced Satan's temptations, he would face them as a man first. And yet he faced them, scripture says, in the power of the Spirit, is what the passage says. And it's interesting that he faced them both in the power of the Spirit and with the tools that he had in his tool belt, which was fasting and the Word. So in the power of the Spirit was on him. And then right after that, he faced all of this stuff as a man, powerless to do anything, and yet used the Word and the Spirit. And then the next passage after that is what I want to focus on. It says, in the power of the Spirit, he returned to Galilee. So it was almost, you get this idea of like Jesus is now on a spiritual high. As a man, he faced all of this powerlessness, and he faced it well. He faced it with the tools that God gave him. And then he's on the spiritual high, and so bam, in the power of the Spirit. I don't know what that looked like. Like flash, you're there, or like the strength to get there because he's been fasting for 40 days and he's weak. I don't know what that looked like, but in the power of the Spirit, he returned to Galilee. It's kind of where we pick up and we talk about he went to the synagogue. So he's on a spiritual high. He had been, previous to that, he had been doing miracles all around. So Galilee, the people of Galilee was his hometown. They had heard of the miracles. And yet that fame didn't change what he did. He walked in to the synagogue as he normally did. It said, as was his custom. He walked into the synagogue and he got up to read scripture. And he read from the book of Isaiah, which said, the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And he sat down. Like, that's the sermon I want to preach. Let's just read the scripture and sit down. So he's on a spiritual high. He's here and he's like, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. So he's going to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and then he gets up to read, as was his custom, and he reads, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. So he was moving in the power because the Spirit was on him. He was implying, to kind of interpret to the people that were listening there, that he was actually the person that Isaiah was talking about, that he was Messiah. And so they actually were okay with that. Like, they wanted to kill him a little bit later because of something else, but they were actually okay that he said that. Like, okay, we've been hearing these miracles that you've been doing. That's great. Okay. But some of them whispered and said, isn't he Joseph's son? Like, that carpenter, Joseph, down the road. Like, And so then Jesus, as if he can read their thoughts, because he could, because he was ministering in the power of the Spirit, he says, basically, you guys don't believe. I know that you're here because you want miracles, like I've been doing down the road. I know that's why you're here. But you don't believe. Actually, the Samaritans, the Gentiles, are better than you because at least they believe. That's when they wanted to kill him. What? Gentiles are not better than me. Okay, say you're the Messiah, whatever, okay. Do miracles for us. And Jesus was kind of saying, it's like people today where they go, I don't know if there's a God. And then they go to the gas station, God, please let me win the lottery today. You know, I mean, it's kind of that, I want a miracle. And yet, isn't that Joseph's son? And so Jesus was saying, yeah, you guys, you don't care. So they chase him out, the passage says. They chase him out of the city, all the way over to a cliff, because they wanted to kill him. And then suddenly it's like this weird phrase that it's random. And then Jesus just walked through the crowds and escaped. And I think of The Incredibles, like Dash, the little boy in the movie The Incredibles. It's like everyone else is moving slow motion suddenly, and Jesus is like here, and then he's there. That's moving in the power of the Spirit. That's what I want when the Spirit is on me, to move like that. Actually, we had my parents, when they were pastoring a church, got a whole bunch of death threats. And I was a teenager, and I remember thinking, where do I put that? Like, when you get a death threat, it was against my dad and all of us. Where do you put that? And it was people in the church, they made it clear. They even had like the little cutout newspaper individual letters that they had put together, and they would like put it under his door at the church office. And like, I just thought, where do I even file that in my brain? And it come to find out, it was actually because we were doing a ministry on Wednesday nights for kids that were in poverty, and they didn't take care of the building as much as we would hope they would. But they were hearing the gospel every week, and we were doing ministry, and it was awesome. And yet, death threats, really, because of that. So when I look back on things like that, and I didn't know where to file that in my brain, I went, okay, you're gonna do stuff just like Jesus did stuff in ministry. You're in the Spirit. You're working. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing. People are still going to get angry. People are still going to be so angry, furious, maybe even death threats, potentially. But you could be right on point. Kind of another story I had thought of to share was, as I think about Jesus reading the scripture of who he was, who the Spirit had called him to. It was to bring freedom to the captives, to free people, to bring the good news of the gospel. People in need, that was who the Spirit was for. He had the Spirit on him in order to work in the Spirit and do. And so as I'm looking at this passage, I'm thinking, there's so many people that are in need. And yeah, we may face stuff. We may face angry people. We may face things that we don't understand. Hello. But in the middle of that, who are we called to serve? And Jesus, he had it right. He was on a spiritual high, and God was working, and God was moving, and he was using all the tools that God had given him, and it was good, and yet people were still battling him. And in the middle of that, Jesus got up and read, "Spirit's on me. This is who I'm called to serve. This is who I'm called to." He stayed focused, and then he sat down. There you go. And I thought, I want to share this last story because people do need help. I worked at a mental health facility in college, and it was one night, the inpatient unit was a lockdown facility that I worked on. So that was upstairs in the second level. And so this one night I was working on the bottom level by myself. Anybody could walk in off the street. It was dark, it was a little scary. And you never knew. This was a place where people could come and detox. It was also a place that people could come and get their medication adjusted. So you really know, my training, my first day of training, I learned how to tackle people effectively.
Nice.
So it was that sort of a place.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was, you never knew what you were gonna expect. So I'm sitting there doing some paperwork, and I hear this man's voice, and he says, "Help!" And I'm like, okay, I thought I was by myself. So I get up, I'm walking around, maybe somebody walked, it didn't sound like he walked in the door, but I'm walking towards the door. And then I hear again, "Help!" I'm like, oh my goodness, okay, I'm moving faster now. What's happening? What's going on? Then I need somebody. So I'm running now. I'm going, what is happening? So I get around the corner and I see this man, and he's disheveled and he's kind of slouched over in a chair, and I didn't even had no idea somebody was in the building with me. And as I get in there, he says, "I need somebody, not just anybody. Help!" And suddenly I smiled because I realized it's a Beatles song. And he's singing, and he's drunk, he's intoxicated. And that was his singing voice, evidently. But that remains. He smiled back at me, and then he continued to sing the song, and I just sort of said, okay, the social worker will be with you in a moment. But it's interesting, the words to that song, though. I need somebody help, not just anybody, right? Not just anybody. People that we are called to, they don't necessarily need us, right? They need the Spirit on us, us working in the power of the Spirit, using the tools that God gave us, not just anybody, right? Not just anybody. Let me read this. As you guys minister to people, may we face our own powerless situations with renewed courage from the Spirit. May we speak freedom over our friends and family. May we bring light where there is darkness. May we offer relief to the oppressed wherever we go. May we proclaim that God's favor rests on those who seek him. And may we bring the help that is needed to those who are seeking. Thank you guys for all you do.
Very good.